Ministry of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment, Barbara Creecy, together with the Presidential Climate Commission, are hosting a national stakeholder consultation ahead of the upcoming Sharm El Sheik International Climate talks that will be taking place next month. Let's take you live there.
So, colleagues, I think as everybody knows, COP27 will take place in Sharm El Sheik in the Arab Republic of Egypt from the 6th to the 18th of November this year. And this particular event is the 27th conference of the parties. It's the 17th conference of the parties, serving as meeting on the Kyoto Protocol. It's the 4th conference of the parties on the Paris Agreement. And there will also be sessions of the 2 subsidiary bodies, the subsidiary body for implementation and also the subsidiary body for scientific and technical advice. Now, I think we all know that COP27 is taking place at a time when there have been complex and strained relations amongst some of the major powers, and of course there is also the Russia-Ukraine war, which is fueling geopolitical tensions. And it's very interesting if you can cast your minds back to this time last year. I think that none of us envisaged that we would be meeting in Sharm El Sheik in a context where there has been disruption of global supply chains, rampant inflation in many countries, and of course energy and food security problems. Now, we are not expecting that these events are going to prevent an outcome to COP27 or to derail the conference, but there is no doubt that they are going to have an impact on the approach of parties as parties go to this conference. And the pre-COP meeting and also some of the other meetings that have taken place in the run-up to COP27 do indicate that we are unlikely to see greater climate ambition, and we probably are not going to see new commitments around means of implementation for developing countries. Now, as you know, there will, in addition to the main negotiations, there will be many side events that will be taking place, and I think that we would obviously hope that as South Africans that will be attending this important function, there will be certain common themes and common issues that all of us will be raising at the conference itself. And I think the first important issue that we are going to need to talk about today is the question of financing, or what is known as the means of implementation, finance and technical support. And I think that we would argue that given the enormity of the resources that are going to be required by developing countries over the next 10 to 15 years, these resources are not necessarily only going to be met through climate financing, and they probably are going to need to be met through transformation of international financial structures and through reform of the multilateral development banks, so that these institutions can be more fit for purpose to assist developing countries to address sustainable development and just transition imperatives. What we are also saying is that most of the financing that is available at the present time for developing countries is loan financing. And what we understand is that many developing countries, in fact, most developing countries have been heavily impacted on, first of all, by the COVID pandemic, and more recently by food and energy shortages. And we do see a situation where many developing countries are facing heavy indebtedness. And we would want to make sure that whatever finance is being made available, both for mitigation and adaptation in the climate space, is not adding to the burden that developing countries are facing. And lastly, we do think that there will be interest in South Africa's just energy transition, and countries will be interested to look at this transition and to consider whether or not it provides a model for their own countries to consider. So the conference will start with a 2-day event where Egypt will be inviting world leaders. And the purpose of that 2-day event, which is taking place in Sharm El Sheik on the 7th and the 8th of November, will be to accelerate climate action and also to generate political support and momentum for the negotiations. And our president will be attending that event and will be making the South African country statement at that event. Now, of course, one of the issues that we are all interested in understanding is, what does the African COP mean for our country as a country on the African continent? And we're hoping that this is going to be an opportunity to raise ambition on mitigation, adaptation, and support for developing countries. We're hoping that it's going to advance financial arrangements around loss and damage. And we hope that it's going to build on the progress that we made at Glasgow on the importance of the concept of just transition. And you would know that a lot of work has gone on over the course of this past year that most of you have been part of to establish the Just Transition Framework. That work was initiated and supported by the Presidential Climate Commission, and the South African government have adopted that framework as being the framework that would guide all transitions that would be taking place. And of course, it would be very important that we would want to see an advance on discussions on the special needs and conditions of Africa. And what are those special needs and conditions? Well, first of all, we've already spoken about the fact that the African continent as a whole is characterized as a developing continent, and many of the countries on the African continent are amongst the least developed countries and most heavily indebted countries. And so one has already spoken about the importance of financing for developing countries. But the second issue about the special needs and circumstances of Africa is the fact that our continent historically has contributed less than 4% to the buildup of global emissions that are now wreaking havoc across the globe. And yet, our continent is one of the continents that is going to be most heavily affected. And across the continent, we're already seeing a devastating drought in the Horn of Africa that is putting the food security and the lives of almost 250 people, a quarter of a billion people, 250 million people at stake. In our own country, we have seen devastating floods. We have also seen severe drought. And of course, we know that all of the small island states are facing rising sea levels and storm surges. And we believe that this combination of the severity of the impact of the climate crisis on our continent and the developing nature, the heavily indebted nature of the continent, all of these circumstances require special consideration. And that is why we would like to see progress at COP27 around the special needs and circumstances of our continent. Now, you would all know that when parties attend COP, countries don't go there just as individuals. They also relate to other countries that would have similar circumstances and would have similar negotiating positions. And first and foremost, we would relate to the African group of negotiators. Those would be the negotiators that have a mandate from the African Ministers on Environment, AMSEN, and also from CAHOSC. CAHOSC is the climate change body of the African Union. And these two bodies would work together to develop a common position for the African group of negotiators. We are currently also the chair of BASICS, and so it means that when we go to COP, we also consult and work with Brazil, India, and China. And of course, there would be other areas where we would work with the G77. Those would be developing countries in the rest of the world, and where we would have common positions on financing and means of implementation and loss and damage with many of the countries that would be in the G77. Now, the first issue that we think is going to need to be on the negotiating agenda at COP27 is we would want to see developed countries honouring the mitigation ambition that they tabled in Glasgow. And we would not want to see a situation where developed countries that are responsible for the climate crisis are backtracking on the commitments that they made last year. The second issue that we would want to see on the agenda is this issue of the just transition. And what we're saying is that as African countries meet their obligations in terms of the Paris Agreement, it's very important that we meet those obligations in a way that supports climate justice. And our just transition framework has really defined climate justice in three senses. First of all, it defines climate justice that those who are vulnerable and who are impacted on by climate change must be part of any discussion or any negotiations that are taking place. Secondly, we have said that as transitions take place, we can't have a situation where some sections of our society, probably the private sector, reap the benefits of the transition, and the risks are carried by workers in vulnerable industries and the communities, vulnerable communities where those workers live. There has to be an equal sharing of risks and benefits. And lastly, our concept of climate justice suggests that the way in which we enter into this transition has to help us with our overall developmental objectives. It has to help us with economic inclusiveness. It has to help us in fighting poverty and inequality. And of course, it has to help us in creating decent jobs. Third issue is increased funding for adaptation. So we all know the story with regard to climate financing, and that story is that commitments have not been honoured. And as a subset of the issues under that, there has been less money available for adaptation than there has been for mitigation. And we are saying that there has to be increased financing available for adaptation, and that has to be a central aspect of the global goal on adaptation. We would like to see COP27 resolving the multiple issues on loss and damage. And of course, it's very important that we now start to address the financing issues for the post-2025 era. So let's quickly get into the three areas: adaptation, means of implementation, mitigation. So we're saying that we need a proper work program on adaptation, and that work program must inform the global stocktake on the assessment of progress. So just as we've had global stocktakes on how far have we gone in realizing mitigation objectives, we need a global stocktake on adaptation. And we need to make sure that there are clear goals and targets for adaptation, and that those goals and targets are linked to concrete numbers around financing. And clearly, there would need to be support in a range of sectors: infrastructure, the built environment, water and food security, all being important areas that would need to be considered. We need a clear roadmap on this concept of doubling the finance that's available for adaptation by 2025. So this has been rhetoric that we've heard over and over again. We need to understand how we're actually going to get to doubling this adaptation financing, and what is going to be the timing and the mechanisms for implementing this doubling of adaptation financing. Now, on mitigation, we're saying that we would want, on mitigation, to reaffirm consideration of domestic circumstances and capacity in the realization of mitigation ambition. But we definitely do not want to see a situation where developed countries renege on their ambition and try and push their responsibilities onto developing countries. And we would want to make sure that any new targets are backed with financial support. I've already spoken about the importance of climate justice in the way in which we approach the mitigation issue. And I think that there are a whole lot of, a whole cluster of issues around developed countries honouring their own targets around financing and around just transitions. And we would also want to see a situation where the mitigation work program does not duplicate or prejudge the global stocktake, which is the mechanism for ratcheting up ambition and enhancing NDCs. Just on finance, so there are a whole range of studies that have been done. This particular one indicates that adaptation costs for the continent will range somewhere between $259 to $407 billion. That's for the whole continent over the next 10 years. And that on average, we would be needing to meet adaptation needs somewhere between 26 $41 billion. And what we need to know is that as we move into this decade, which is the decade where we should be realizing ambition, that there is going to be new finance, that we are going to be able to quantify that finance, and that it's going to be predictable. Because a lot of the problem with the existing financing is that it's not new, it's difficult to quantify, and it's definitely not predictable. We need to know when the 100 billion target will be met, because this is a fundamental issue around trust and around rebuilding trust between developed and developing countries. And as I've said before, we need to make sure that not only is the finance new, quantifiable and predictable, but it must not exacerbate existing indebtedness. Now, we're imagining, ladies and gentlemen, that loss and damage is going to be a very thorny issue at COP27. And the loss and damage predictions, the cost of loss and damage on our continent over the next 10 years is predicted to be somewhere between 289 and 440 billion US dollars. And we want COP27 to finalize agreement on the governance of loss and damage under the Santiago network. And it's going to be very important that we engage there on the scale of support as well as programming options. And it's also going to be important that the type of support is going to come directly to governments, that it's going to have a public finance aspect as well as a loan finance aspect, and that it's linked to this very vexed issue of debt reform. And lastly, we're saying that, of course, it is going to be important that this financing, once again, does not exacerbate the indebtedness. Now, I've spoken already about the considerable work that we've done in our country around the just transition. And I think that we want to make sure that our thinking around the just transition is shared with other countries, and our approach to climate justice becomes embedded in the UNFCCC process, and that our definitions and our approach really becomes mainstreamed in the negotiating process. And we see that as being incredibly important, because we don't think that we can go on with a situation where we are increasing ambition unless that ambition is very clearly linked to the question of climate justice and, of course, to means of support and implementation. So, what are we going to need to do in order to get success around all of these issues? We're going to have to narrow the gap between the pledges and the actual implementation. We're going to have to rebuild trust between developed and developing countries. We're going to have a clear commitment to supporting climate justice or just transitions in developing countries. And we're going to have to build momentum for clear global economic reforms around the multilateral development banks and debt restructuring to reduce the debt burden that the climate transition is going to place on developing countries. And of course, as always, we stand ready, and we hope we will be able to play a constructive role in the talks. Thank you very much.
All right, Barbara Creecy, the Minister of Forestry and Fisheries and the Environment, speaking about the forthcoming COP27 that's taking place in Egypt next month.